You think the worst thing a man can do is steal your credit? Wrong. The worst thing is stealing from a woman patient enough to spend 6 months digging a hole so deep sunlight will never reach him. He thought I was a silent pawn. He didn't know the second he erased me from that patent. I started rewriting his entire existence. Grab some popcorn. This is how I destroyed a tech billionaire. Hello and welcome back to Boss Revenge Stories. And thank you so deeply for your continued support of our channel. Unfortunately, YouTube has completely disabled our channel's monetization, leaving us with zero budget to operate, which means we are forced to halt all new video uploads here for the foreseeable future and shift our operations entirely to Patreon. If you enjoyed today's story, please consider supporting us by joining the Boss Revenge Stories Patreon, where you will get access to even better, longer, and incredibly detailed exclusive true stories, featuring multiple emotional voice actors that we simply cannot publish publicly on YouTube. You can join us right now by scanning the Patreon QR code on your screen or by clicking the link provided in the description or the pinned comment of this video. Now, let us dive right into today's story and meet our brilliant architect of ruin, Charlie Wright. The Nevada desert has a specific scent right before the sun dips below the horizon. It smells like baked dust, dry sage, and absolute desolation. But standing in the VIP viewing pavilion on that late Tuesday afternoon, the only thing I could smell was the suffocating stench of expensive Tom Ford cologne and unearned arrogance. I am Charlie Wright. I am 32 years old, and I am the lead navigation systems engineer for Aetheris Dynamics. Or, at least, I was the one who actually did the work. I stood quietly in this back row of the shaded viewing deck, a slender crystal flute of champagne resting gently in my right hand. The glass was perfectly chilled, a sharp contrast to the blistering heat radiating from the desert floor. Less than 50 feet away from me, standing on a meticulously constructed presentation stage, was Julian Sterling. Julian was our project manager, a man whose entire career was built on a foundation of a commercial, blindingly white smile and an uncanny ability to take credit for the genius of the people beneath him. Right now, he was pacing the stage, gesturing wildly with his perfectly manicured hands, pitching my life's work to a captive audience of decorated Pentagon generals and deep-pocketed Silicon Valley investors. Above us, the sky was a canvas of fading orange and deep purple, but no one was looking at the sunset. All eyes were fixed on the sky above the testing range, where 500 autonomous drones were executing a flawless, synchronized military formation. They moved like a school of silverfish, diving and weaving with zero latency, entirely guided by the unmanned swarm navigation algorithm. The green LED lights on their underbellies glowed in unison, painting a mesmerizing picture of future warfare and limitless profit. Julian leaned into the microphone, his voice dripping with practiced charisma. What you are witnessing today, ladies and gentlemen, is not just a leap in tactical aerospace technology. It is a complete paradigm shift, an algorithm so intuitive, it practically breathes. Listening to him speak my words, my concepts, my late-night breakthroughs, I felt a familiar coldness settle over my chest. It was the exact same coldness I had felt exactly 6 months ago. 6 months ago, on a rainy Thursday evening, I had stayed late in the server room to finalize the documentation for our intellectual property submission. I logged into the executive directory to verify the routing numbers, only to find a completed, digitally signed application already sitting in the outgoing queue for the United States Patent and Trademark Office. I opened the file, expecting to see my name listed as the primary inventor. Just as we had agreed, instead, staring back at me in bold, undeniable black text, was Julian Sterling. He had secretly erased my name from the entire filing, replacing it with his own to secure a massive promotion and solidify his golden boy status with the board of directors. He had effectively stolen 5 years of my sweat, my tears, and my intellectual property, wiping my existence from the project with a single keystroke. Most people would have marched right into his office. Most people would have thrown a massive tantrum, threatened a lawsuit, gone to human resources, or screamed until their vocal cords tore. But human resources exist to protect the company, not the employees. And Julian was the company's golden goose. If I had made a fuss that day, I would have been labeled an emotional, disgruntled female engineer and quietly managed out of the industry. So, instead of screaming, I went back to my desk. I drank a lukewarm cup of black coffee, and I started writing a new piece of code. I spent the next 6 months digging a grave so deep that Julian would never be able to climb out of it. I quietly and meticulously inserted a backdoor into the core software of the entire drone swarm. It was a beautiful piece of digital sabotage, hidden beneath layers of encrypted diagnostic protocols where no quality assurance tester would ever think to look. I did not just plant a bomb, I tied the detonator directly to the man himself. I synchronized the backdoor's countdown timer to the exact local network time broadcasted by the very smart watch Julian wore on his left wrist, the same watch he was currently raising in the air to emphasize his grand finale. "This technology will redefine the battlefield," Julian announced, his voice echoing across the desert dunes through the massive sound system. He paused, flashing that sickeningly perfect smile toward the four-star generals sitting in the front row. He spread his arms wide, as if he were embracing the sky itself. "This, my friends, is the legacy of Julian Sterling." That was the exact moment the digital clock on his wrist struck 5:15 in the afternoon, high above the desert floor. The low, mechanical hum of 500 synchronized rotors suddenly changed pitch. The graceful, flowing movement of the drone swarm violently jerked to a halt. 500 drones froze in midair, defying the very laws of physics and aerodynamics they had been demonstrating just seconds prior. They hovered there, dead still, like a paused video frame. A murmur of confusion rippled through the crowd of VIPs. A general in the front row leaned forward, narrowing his eyes. Julian's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. He tapped his earpiece, likely expecting an update from the control tent. But I knew the control tent was currently locked out of every terminal. Then it happened. In perfect, terrifying unison. The glowing green LED lights on the bellies of all 500 drones snapped off. The desert sky went dark for exactly 1 second. When the lights snapped back on, they were no longer a friendly, functional green. They were a blazing, aggressive, blinding red. The audience gasped. The drones began to move again, but no longer in their tactical combat formations. They shifted rapidly, seamlessly reorganizing themselves across the vast canvas of the darkening Nevada sky. They were taking up new positions, locking into a massive, rigid grid. Julian turned around, shielding his eyes from the sudden red glare, staring up at the swarm he claimed to have built. The drones settled into their final coordinates, illuminating the twilight with a glowing, flawless, and massive wall of text that stretched hundreds of feet across the sky. The bright red letters hovered over the desert. Impossible to ignore, impossible to misinterpret. Patent US 90210CW, author Charlie Wright. Approved. The silence that fell over the pavilion was absolute. It was a heavy, suffocating, dead silence, broken only by the whistling of the dry desert wind and the faint, collective hum of my 500 mechanical messengers hovering above. The generals stared at the sky. The investors stared at the sky. Julian stood absolutely petrified. His jaw went slack. The blood drained completely from his perfectly tanned face, leaving him looking like a hollow wax figure. His hand began to tremble, so violently that his fingers simply gave out. The sleek black wireless microphone slipped from his grasp. It hit the wooden floor of the stage with a heavy thud, triggering a massive, piercing screech of audio feedback through the giant speakers that made several investors wince and cover their ears. Julian did not move to pick it up. He just stood there, paralyzed by the colossal weight of his own sudden destruction, bathed in the red light of my undeniable victory. Back in the shadows of the viewing deck, I did not laugh. I did not cheer. I simply brought the chilled crystal flute to my lips, took a slow, deliberate sip of the crisp champagne, and let the magnificent, dead silence of hundreds of powerful people wash over me like a warm summer rain. The agonizing screech of audio. Feedback from the dropped microphone finally snapped Julian out of his paralyzed stupor. His survival instincts kicked in, though they were entirely misplaced. He whipped his head toward the glass-enclosed technical control booth, positioned just off the main stage. His face was a mask of sheer panic, his pristine image shattering into a million jagged pieces. He began frantically waving his arms, dragging his index finger across his throat in a desperate, violent slashing motion, signaling the engineering team to cut the power immediately. Inside the booth, total chaos erupted. Through the tinted glass, I could see the lead technician slamming his palms against the main console, his face pale and slick with sweat. He was frantically typing command after command, trying to force a manual override. But my code was absolute. I had locked out all local area network access, encrypting the command pathways with a military-grade cipher that would take their systems exactly 365 days to crack. The kill switch was dead. The power grid was completely bypassed. High above the desert floor, my red glowing drones refused to budge a single inch. They hung there in the darkening sky, utterly immovable, acting as 500 glowing, indisputable witnesses to his massive fraud. Down in the VIP seating area, the atmosphere shifted violently from awe to severe agitation. The dead silence broke, instantly replaced by a chaotic storm of furious whispers and urgent conversations. The high-profile investors from Silicon Valley were already pulling out their secure satellite phones, frantically dialing their risk management teams. In the front row, a heavily decorated four-star general abruptly stood up, his medals clinking sharply against his uniform. He crossed his arms over his chest, his brow furrowed in a deep, menacing scowl. He did not ask politely. He barked an order, demanding an immediate and thorough explanation for the massive security breach happening right above his head. Julian was completely drowning. Sweat poured down his forehead, ruining his expensive haircut and soaking the collar of his custom-tailored shirt. His hands shook violently as he bent down and fumbled to retrieve the dropped microphone. He stood back up, panting heavily, and forced a sickeningly fake, trembling smile onto his face. "Ladies and gentlemen, please, there is absolutely no need for alarm," Julian stammered, his voice cracking over the massive speaker system. He let out a desperate, breathy laugh that sounded closer to a sob. "What you are seeing up there is just a minor software display glitch. We recently brought on a new team of summer interns from the engineering department, and it seems they decided to play a highly inappropriate practical joke with the visual rendering code. We will have it reset in just a few moments." It was a pathetic, insulting lie, and every single person in that pavilion knew it, before Julian could utter another desperate excuse. Two men rose from the third row of the VIP section. They were not investors. They were not military personnel. They were my legal team, dressed in immaculate, sharply tailored black suits. They had seamlessly blended into the crowd hours ago, waiting for my exact signal, moving with terrifying, synchronized precision. They ignored the frantic event ushers trying to block their path. They marched straight up the wooden steps of the presentation stage, their expressions completely devoid of any emotion. The taller of the two lawyers stepped directly into Julian's personal space, effectively backing the panicked executive against the podium. Without breaking stride, he pulled a thick, heavy manila envelope from the inner pocket of his suit jacket and slammed it directly into the center of Julian's chest. Julian flinched, reflexively grabbing the envelope before it fell to the floor. "Julian Sterling," the lawyer announced, his deep voice carrying clearly without the need for a microphone. "You have been formally served by order of the Federal District Court. You are hereby summoned to answer for multiple felony charges of intellectual property fraud, corporate espionage, and grand larceny." That was my cue. I finally stepped out from the cool, concealing shadows of the catering tent. The sharp, authoritative click of my heels against the metal grating echoed through the tense air as I walked calmly toward the main control console positioned at the edge of the stage. Every single camera, every single pair of eyes, shifted away from the sky and locked directly onto me. I reached the console and pulled a heavy, ruggedized tablet from my satchel with a fluid, dismissive motion. I threw it onto the metal desk right in front of Julian. The heavy device clattered loudly against the surface. The master encryption key to regain control of those drones is on that tablet. Julian, I state, projecting my voice so loudly and clearly that it carried all the way to the back rows of the pavilion. I turned my back to him, facing the stunned crowd of generals and billionaires. Though it will not do him or this company much good now. Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Charlie Wright. I am the sole architect of the swarm algorithm you just witnessed. Aetherist Dynamics has spent the last 2 hours trying to sell the United States military a completely stolen product. There is no intern prank. There is only a thief standing on this stage. Julian's fake smile completely vanished, replaced by a deep, ugly crimson rage. The veins in his neck bulged as he lost whatever shred of sanity he had left. He lunged forward, pointing a trembling finger right at my face. "Security!" Julian roared, spit flying from his lips. "Get this lunatic off my stage right now. You are fired. Right, do you hear me? You are terminated. Escort her off the premises. As of this exact second, your career in this industry is completely dead and buried." I did not flinch. I did not take a single step back. I just looked at his pathetic, sweating face and offered a small, casual shrug of my shoulders. "That is a very interesting threat, Julian," I replied, keeping my tone entirely conversational and perfectly calm. "But you cannot fire the person who submitted a hostile, all-cash buyout offer for this entire company at exactly 8 o'clock this morning." Julian froze. His mouth opened and closed silently like a suffocating fish. His arm dropped to his side, his entire posture crumbling as the absolute devastating reality of his situation finally crashed down upon him. He stood there, utterly speechless, drowning in the paralyzing shock of realizing he was no longer the predator, but the prey caught perfectly in my trap. The emergency board meeting took place less than 48 hours later. Buried deep inside the heavily soundproofed conference room on the 42nd floor of the corporate headquarters, the air conditioning was running at maximum capacity, pumping freezing air through the ventilation shafts. Yet the 11 men and women seated around the massive mahogany table looked as though they were suffocating in a sauna. The tension in the room was a living, breathing entity, wrapping its cold fingers around their throats. At the head of the table sat Richard, the chairman of the board. He was a man who usually commanded a room with absolute authority, but today, his silver hair looked slightly disheveled, and his posture was rigid with suppressed panic. He pushed a sleek, black leather folder slowly across the polished wood until it rested directly in front of my empty chair. Inside lay a legally binding non-disclosure agreement and a freshly printed cashier's check. $5 million. "Charlie," Richard said, attempting to coat his desperation in a layer of practiced, fatherly diplomacy. "Tax-free, fully vested, and available for withdrawal this exact minute. Furthermore, the board is prepared to formally amend the patent filing with the United States Patent and Trademark Office. We will list you as the primary co-author alongside Julian. This is a remarkably generous off-ramp for everyone involved. You receive your financial compensation. You secure your industry recognition. And Aetherist Dynamics avoids a catastrophic public relations nightmare. We shake hands right now, and we all walk away wealthy." I stood behind my chair, looking down at the small piece of paper. $5 million. To these people, it was merely an operational expense, the cost of purchasing a thick rug to sweep their toxic waste under. To me, it was a profound insult. I did not reach for the folder. I kept my hands folded neatly in front of me, perfectly relaxed. "You fundamentally misunderstand the architecture of this situation, Richard," I replied, my voice dangerously soft, cutting through the hum of the air conditioning like a scalpel. "I am not here to negotiate a comfortable severance package, and I am certainly not here to share a byline with a parasite. I did not spend 6 grueling months maintaining absolute silence, working until 3 in the morning, just to secure a paycheck and a pat on the head." I stepped forward, reaching into the inner pocket of my tailored blazer. I pulled out a small, heavily encrypted black flash drive. I walked slowly over to the main media console at the far end of the long table and plugged the drive directly into the master port. "For half a year," I continued, Turning to face the executives, Julian assumed I was just another obedient worker bee, too timid to challenge his authority. What he did not realize was that the exact moment he forged my signature and stole my patent, he handed me the perfect justification to perform a complete, unrestricted digital autopsy on his entire network infrastructure. I bypassed his personal biometric firewalls. I recovered his permanently deleted archives. I went digging through the darkest, rotting corners of this company. And what I found festering in the dark goes far beyond simple corporate theft. I tapped the digital touchscreen on the console. The massive frosted glass wall behind me instantly shifted, transforming into a state-of-the-art, high-definition projection screen. A cascading series of digital documents appeared, illuminating the dimly lit room with a harsh, unforgiving white glare. They were not formatted in standard corporate templates. They were fractured lines of code, complex routing tables, and heavily encrypted messages that had been bounced through multiple proxy servers before I had forcefully decrypted them. These, I announced, pointing at the glowing screen, are direct authenticated communications between your golden boy, Julian Sterling, and a highly classified broker representing a private mercenary syndicate currently operating out of Eastern Europe. A paramilitary group known strictly for executing black market military operations beyond the reach of international law. The room went entirely dead silent, the kind of silence where you could hear a pin drop or a career end. Someone at the far end of the table swallowed hard, the sound echoing unnaturally loud. Julian was not merely trying to secure a legitimate government contract for Etheris, I explained, scrolling through the damning text on the screen so every board member could read the explicit details. He was aggressively negotiating to sell a completely unredacted, unencrypted copy of the swarm source code to this syndicate. He was preparing to hand over advanced, autonomous weaponized navigation technology to a rogue organization for a private, off-the-books payout of $25 million, deposited directly into a blind offshore trust in the Cayman Islands. Richard's face drained of all color, transforming into a mask of pure gray ash. That is impossible. That is a massive federal crime. That is high treason. Richard, I corrected him sharply, my eyes locking onto his. But unfortunately for every single person sitting at this table, treason is not the worst thing he has done. Let us go back in time exactly 14 months. I tapped the console screen again. The decrypted emails vanished instantly, replaced by a grainy, raw security camera feed, time-stamped from the previous spring. 14 months ago, the swarm algorithm was still in its infancy. It was highly unstable and possessed a critical, lethal flaw in its autonomous collision avoidance logic. I repeatedly warned Julian that live-fire testing was completely out of the question. I personally submitted 4 separate, detailed risk assessment reports stating definitively that the drones would inevitably lose spatial awareness in confined environments. Julian completely ignored every single report. I pressed the play button. The video displayed a massive, isolated chemical storage warehouse located on the far outskirts of the company's private testing facility. It was the dead of night, illuminated only by harsh floodlights. Julian wanted spectacular visual results to show you, the investors, so he bypassed the Safety Oversight Committee, forged the authorization signatures, and ordered an illegal, undocumented live flight test. On the massive screen, a single, heavy payload drone zoomed into the frame. For a few agonizing seconds, it hovered steadily. Then, exactly as I had predicted, the faulty algorithm critically failed. The drone suddenly jerked wildly to the right, its rotors screaming as it accelerated at maximum velocity straight into the reinforced side of the warehouse. The resulting explosion captured on the video was absolutely catastrophic. A massive, blinding fireball ripped through the corrugated metal roof, lighting up the night sky like a second sunrise. The blast wave visibly shook the security camera violently before the feed abruptly cut to static snow. That single act of monumental, blinding arrogance incinerated a warehouse storing highly reactive industrial solvents, I said, my voice dropping an octave, carrying the weight of a judge delivering a death sentence. The resulting blaze caused tens of millions of dollars in structural and chemical damage. It was an absolute miracle no human being was burned alive in that inferno. I paused, stepping away from the screen, letting the heavy, suffocating truth wrap its hands tightly around their throats. But a disaster of that magnitude requires a scapegoat, I continued, pacing slowly behind the row of leather chairs. Julian could not let his pristine, golden track record take the hit. So, he fabricated a comprehensive trail of digital evidence. He explicitly manipulated the system event logs to make it look as though a junior engineer named David deliberately uploaded a corrupted patch right before the flight. Julian fired David the very next morning, threatened him with total financial ruin and endless litigation, and completely destroyed a brilliant 23-year-old kid's entire future just to cover his own tracks. I stopped at the head of the table, leaning in close to the omnidirectional microphone resting in the center of the wood. And then, I whispered, delivering the final, fatal blow. Julian forged the safety and compliance reports. He officially certified to the United States Pentagon that no catastrophic failures had ever occurred during the entire development cycle. He committed massive, undeniable federal fraud to secure the military contract you were all happily celebrating with champagne on Tuesday afternoon. The silence that followed was not just heavy, it was apocalyptic. The board members were no longer looking at me with the weary annoyance of corporate executives dealing with a nuisance. They were staring at the glowing screen with absolute, unadulterated terror in their eyes. The comfortable illusion of a quick, quiet financial settlement had evaporated into thin air. The 11 powerful men and women who had confidently walked into this room, fully prepared to protect their star employee and silence a problematic engineer, finally realized the true, horrifying scale of the trap they were currently standing in. They were no longer dealing with a disgruntled employee looking for a larger slice of the pie. They were holding the bag for a man who had committed federal fraud, destroyed innocent lives, and actively engaged in high treason against the United States government. They knew the Department of Defense would not just quietly cancel their lucrative contracts. The federal government would descend upon them like a hurricane. They would dismantle Aetherist Dynamics piece by piece, seize every asset, and every single person sitting in this room would be subpoenaed, mercilessly investigated, and potentially imprisoned for decades as accessories to a global crime syndicate. Richard's hands were shaking so violently, he had to place them flat on the mahogany table just to steady himself. He looked down at the $5 million check resting uselessly in the folder, then slowly raised his head to look at me, his eyes wide, hollow, and completely broken. They were entirely, undeniably mine. Julian, barricaded inside his luxurious corner office, and realizing the board of directors was rapidly distancing themselves from him, knew he was running out of options. The walls were closing in, and the sterile air of the executive suite suddenly felt suffocating. But a man like Julian always believed he had one final, desperate card to play. He picked up his secure phone and dialed Chloe. Chloe was not just his stunning fiancée. She was the ruthless, highly effective director of public relations for Aetherist Dynamics. She controlled the narrative. Julian's voice was frantic, dripping with manufactured victimhood as he ordered her to execute a scorched earth smear campaign against me. He commanded her to draft a press release framing me as a mentally unstable, disgruntled extortionist. He wanted the world to believe I was suffering from severe delusions and attempting to blackmail the company for money I did not earn. His strategy was transparently obvious. He needed me entirely discredited in the court of public opinion before federal investigators could even begin their paperwork. Chloe, fiercely protective of the empire she thought they were building together, immediately went to work. She typed up a venomous, career-ending press release designed to destroy my reputation permanently. But precisely 45 minutes before she was scheduled to hit send and blast the lie to every major media outlet in the country, her phone buzzed. It was not a message from Julian. It was a highly encrypted, anonymous calendar invite directing her to a dim, sparsely populated espresso bar located deep in the third basement level of our corporate tower. When Chloe arrived, her sharp heels clicking aggressively against the polished concrete floor, She was gripping her tablet tightly, entirely ready to confront a cowardly corporate whistleblower. Instead, she found me. I was sitting quietly in a secluded corner booth, stirring a cup of black tea, blending perfectly into the shadows of the underground cafe. Chloe marched directly over to my table, her eyes narrowing with absolute, unadulterated disdain. She did not sit down. She leaned heavily over the table, her voice a harsh, venomous whisper. "You have exactly 2 minutes. Charlie, give me one good reason why I should not press this button right now and ensure you never work in a civilized city again." I did not flinch. I did not offer a defensive argument or plead for her mercy. I simply reached into my structured leather bag, retrieved a thick, matte black envelope, and slid it smoothly across the polished granite tabletop until it touched her fingertips. Chloe stared at the dark envelope for a fraction of a second. Her blind loyalty to Julian fought a brief, violent war with her innate, journalistic curiosity. Curiosity won. She tore the wax seal open and pulled out the contents. Inside the envelope, there were no complex algorithmic schematics or lines of stolen code. There were crystal clear, high-resolution photographs. They were undeniably explicit pictures of Julian entering various luxury hotel rooms with 3 different female partners over the course of the past 12 months. But for a woman as coldly ambitious and intelligent as Chloe, simple physical infidelity was merely a minor insult. The true devastating weapon lay in the financial statements neatly stapled beneath the photographs. I watched the color completely drain from her face as her perfectly manicured fingernails traced the highlighted lines of a Cayman Islands bank ledger. Julian had not just been cheating on her. He had been systematically siphoning hundreds of thousands of dollars directly from their shared personal investment fund. He had used her hard-earned money to buy those women diamond necklaces, designer handbags, and first-class flights to Paris. Her breathing hitched, her chest rising and falling rapidly, but I was not finished breaking her reality. "Keep digging, Chloe," I instructed, my tone entirely devoid of sympathy. Her trembling hands pulled out the final stack of documents from the very bottom of the envelope. It was a meticulously drafted legal contingency plan, signed exclusively by Julian and heavily notarized. The document clearly, legally outlined a strategy to name Chloe as the sole architect of the offshore accounts and the primary financial liaison for the Eastern European mercenary syndicate. If his treasonous, illegal sale of my source code ever went sour and the federal authorities closed in, Julian had structured the entire corporate hierarchy to ensure the government would arrest his future wife. He had deliberately constructed a massive paper trail to use the woman he promised to marry as his ultimate scapegoat, shielding himself completely from the blast radius. He was entirely prepared to let her rot in a federal penitentiary for the rest of her natural life, just so he could keep his freedom and his stolen fortune. Sitting across from her, I watched the exact moment Chloe's love for Julian died. It did not fade away slowly. It violently shattered, instantly replaced by a cold, calculating, and absolute rage. A terrifying calm washed over her features. She slowly set the damning documents down on the table. She looked at the tablet in her left hand, the screen still glowing brightly with the drafted press release meant to destroy my life. Without a single word of hesitation, without shedding a single tear, she selected all the text and deleted it permanently. Then, operating with the lethal efficiency that made her the best in the business, Chloe used her highest level of executive media clearance to access the master servers. She uploaded every single photograph, every single bank statement, and the entire treasonous legal contingency plan into a secure, heavily encrypted digital folder. She did not send it to just one sympathetic journalist. She bypassed the standard corporate channels entirely and sent the massive package simultaneously to the top 10 largest newspapers in the United States, attaching a remarkably simple subject line: "The true face of Etheris." The fallout was instantaneous, brutal, and absolute. By exactly 8 o'clock the next morning, Julian arrived at the corporate plaza, wearing a fresh tailored suit, entirely oblivious to the apocalyptic storm Chloe had unleashed while he slept. He walked arrogantly toward the main glass turnstiles and confidently swiped his executive badge. The reader flashed a harsh, unforgiving red light. Access denied. Two heavily armed building security guards immediately stepped forward, physically blocking his path, firmly instructing him that he was trespassing and needed to step away from the property immediately. Confused, indignant, and furious, Julian turned around to demand an explanation, only to see the entire contents of his luxurious corner office dumped unceremoniously into three large, cheap cardboard boxes sitting on the damp concrete sidewalk. Before he could even process the sheer humiliation of his belongings sitting in the dirt, a massive fleet of white news vans screeched to a halt along the curb behind him. Dozens of reporters and cameramen swarmed him like starving vultures, shoving microphones into his face, blinding him with camera flashes, and screaming rapid-fire questions about federal fraud, stolen joint funds, and his impending indictment for high treason. The underground parking structure of my apartment building always felt like a concrete tomb, even on a good day. It was located 3 stories below street level, filled with the thick, stale scent of engine exhaust, damp dust, and leaking motor oil. At 2 o'clock in the morning, the suffocating silence of level -3 was absolute. I parked my car, the engine cutting out and leaving me surrounded entirely by the heavy, humming quiet of the building's massive ventilation fans. The overhead fluorescent lights flickered erratically, casting long, distorted shadows across the cold, gray floor. I stepped out of the vehicle, my keys resting quietly in the palm of my right hand, the heavy steel door shutting with a hollow thud behind me. I had only taken exactly 5 steps toward the reinforced glass doors of the elevator lobby when 2 massive figures stepped out from the blind spot behind a thick structural pillar. They were not residents coming home late. They were large, brutal-looking men wearing heavy leather jackets, moving with the silent, practiced efficiency of professional muscle. They fanned out slowly, deliberately blocking my only path to the exit, their hands resting menacingly inside their deep coat pockets. I stopped walking. I did not scream. I did not reach for my phone. I just stood perfectly still, waiting. From the darkest corner of the parking garage, the erratic, echoing click of hard dress shoes sounded against the concrete. A third man emerged from the shadows. It was Julian, but the man walking toward me was a horrifying, shattered ghost of the polished, arrogant executive I had destroyed just days prior. His expensive designer suit was violently rumpled and heavily stained. He had not shaved. His eyes were bloodshot and sunken deep into his skull, and his frantic breath reeked of cheap whiskey and absolute raw desperation. He was a cornered animal, entirely stripped of his corporate armor, vibrating with a frantic, unhinged energy that made him incredibly dangerous. He aggressively closed the distance between us, stopping just inches from my face. He reached into his ruined coat and violently shoved a crumpled, heavily creased legal document toward my chest. I glanced down. It was a formal intellectual property transfer agreement, bundled alongside a binding petition to permanently dismiss all pending federal civil litigation. "Sign it!" Julian hissed, his voice a ragged, breathless rasp that bounced off the low ceiling. "You are going to take this pen, Charlie, and you are going to sign this document right now. You are going to tell the authorities that the emails were a complete fabrication, that you orchestrated a massive corporate sabotage campaign because you were deeply in love with me and I rejected you. You will swear under oath that you planted those files to frame me. You will take the fall for every single thing that happened at Aetherist Dynamics. You are going to restore my name, and you are going to do it tonight." I looked at the trembling silver pen in his hand, then slowly raised my gaze back up to his bloodshot, crazed eyes. "And if I refuse your generous offer?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper, yet carrying no trace of fear. Julian let out a dry, manic laugh, his face twisting into an ugly, terrifying sneer. He gestured wildly toward the 2 hulking men standing menacingly behind me. "Then you never leave this basement. Do you understand me? You took my multi-million-dollar company. You took my pristine reputation. You took my future wife and my absolute freedom. I have absolutely nothing left to lose. Charlie, If you do not sign that paper and fix my life right this exact second, these two gentlemen are going to put you in the trunk of that car. You are going to simply disappear from the face of the earth, and no one will ever find a single trace of you." The violent threat hung heavily in the stagnant, freezing air of the garage. He wanted me to beg. He needed to see the terror in my eyes to regain a tiny fraction of the immense power he had permanently lost. I looked at him for a long, quiet moment. I did not blink. I did not take a single step backward to retreat. Instead, I calmly raised my right hand and gently adjusted the crisp lapel of my silk blouse. "You always forget to check for the latest software updates, Julian," I said, my voice echoing clearly and perfectly steady in the empty cavern, "including the ones running inside the building management system." Before Julian could even process the meaning of my words, the entire parking garage exploded into blinding, artificial daylight. Every single emergency floodlight, every high-voltage security lamp in the underground structure flared to maximum capacity simultaneously. The sudden, searing brightness was like staring directly into the sun. Julian shrieked, throwing his hands over his eyes and stumbling backward blindly. The two thugs shielded their faces, entirely disoriented by the violent, unexpected flash of light. The tense silence of the garage was instantly shattered by the deafening screech of heavy tires. 3 black tactical vans, which had been sitting silently in the completely unlit visitor parking section, suddenly roared to life. They accelerated violently, boxing us in from all 3 sides in a matter of seconds. The heavy steel side doors slammed open. "Federal Bureau of Investigation, drop your weapons and get on the ground right now. Show me your hands. Get down. Get down on the ground." Over a dozen heavily armed tactical agents flooded the concrete perimeter, clad in dark protective vests, their assault rifles raised and locked onto their targets. The bright red beams of their laser sights cut through the dusty air, painting glowing dots across the chests and foreheads of Julian and his hired muscle. The deafening shouts of the agents echoed violently against the walls, creating an overwhelming wall of sound and absolute authority. The two thugs did not even bother to fight or attempt to run. Recognizing the overwhelming, lethal force of a coordinated federal raid, they immediately dropped to their knees, placing their large hands flat on the top of their heads in total surrender. Julian, completely blinded and paralyzed by the sheer volume of screaming agents, simply collapsed. His legs gave out beneath him, and he crashed hard onto the unforgiving concrete. 2 agents immediately descended upon him, roughly grabbing his arms and forcing them behind his back. The sharp, heavy click of steel handcuffs echoed loudly, a sound of absolute devastating finality. I stood perfectly still in the center of the chaos, entirely untouched, slowly lowering my hand from the collar of my blouse. Nestled discreetly inside the fabric was a military-grade microtransmitter. I had personally arranged the anonymous tip to the Federal Witness Protection Task Force exactly 6 hours ago, warning them of an imminent violent threat to a key informant in a massive treason investigation. The tiny microphone had just broadcasted Julian's entire extortion attempt and physical death threat in crystal clear, high-definition audio, directly to the mobile command van parked just 30 feet away. The agents hauled Julian up to his knees. His face was pressed awkwardly toward the dirty floor, his shoulders trembling uncontrollably. He looked up at me, his eyes wide, wild, and swimming in total, irreversible panic. Looking up from the dirt, surrounded by federal agents, he finally understood the absolute, inescapable depth of the grave I had dug for him. I walked slowly across the pavement, my heels clicking sharply. Stopping right in front of him, I looked down at the ruined, pathetic man kneeling at my feet. I leaned in close, letting my voice drop to a cold, razor-sharp whisper, so only he could hear me over the chaotic shouting of the agents securing the perimeter. "You wanted my patent that badly, Julian?" I asked softly, a terrifyingly serene smile spreading across my face. "Then you can take it to federal prison and admire it. The justice system usually moves at a glacial pace, but when you attempt to sell classified military technology to foreign mercenaries and threaten a key federal informant on an open microphone, The wheels of justice suddenly spin with terrifying velocity. Exactly 1 month after the raid in that freezing underground parking garage, Julian stood before a federal judge. He looked small, hollowed out, wearing a bright orange jumpsuit that swallowed his shrinking frame. The gavel fell with a heavy, final crack. He was sentenced to a mandatory 15 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary, with zero possibility of early parole. The charges were comprehensive and devastating: federal fraud, grand larceny of commercial trade secrets, and felony witness intimidation. Meanwhile, Aetherist Dynamics was bleeding to death. The public scandal was a catastrophic wound. The Pentagon immediately froze every single active contract. The stock price plummeted 99% in a matter of days, transforming a multi-billion-dollar tech empire into a worthless, burning shipwreck. The board of directors, the same people who had tried to buy my silence for $5 million, were now facing total financial ruin and endless federal audits. But I was not finished. The true masterstroke of this entire operation was never just about putting Julian in a cage. It was about taking the throne. The following Tuesday, I walked into the heavily guarded halls of the Pentagon. I was no longer there as a complaining witness or a discarded engineer. I arrived as the supreme negotiator. I sat across a massive oak table from the highest-ranking generals in the Department of Defense. I laid out a very simple, undeniable proposition: the swarm navigation algorithm, the most advanced tactical aerospace technology on the planet, now legally belonged entirely to me. I offered them an exclusive, ironclad licensing agreement for the software, but I had one non-negotiable condition. The federal government would provide me with a heavily subsidized, closed-door line of credit, giving me the exact capital required to execute a hostile takeover of the rotting corpse of Aetherist Dynamics for pennies on the dollar. The generals looked at the flawless schematics, then looked at me. They recognized absolute power when it sat across from them. The government agreed to my terms. Within 48 hours, the acquisition was complete. I personally marched into the executive boardroom and officially ousted every single member of the old guard. I liquidated their shares, restructured the entire corporate hierarchy from the ground up, and legally rebranded the empire. Aetherist Dynamics was dead. Wright Aerospace was born, and I placed myself firmly in the chief executive officer chair. The view from the top floor of the corporate tower in downtown Seattle is truly breathtaking, especially when the morning fog rolls off the Puget Sound. I stood by the massive floor-to-ceiling windows of my new corner office, sipping a hot cup of black tea, surveying the city. My assistant walked in silently and placed a single piece of incoming mail on my mahogany desk. It was a handwritten letter, stamped by the Federal Prison Mail Sorting Facility. It was from Julian. The handwriting was frantic, sloppy, and stained with what looked like tears. Over 3 desperate pages, he begged me. He pleaded with me to drop the final, crushing civil lawsuit I had filed against him. He cried that the government had already seized his homes, his cars, and his accounts. He was begging me to let him keep his mother's small estate, the very last asset he had left to his name, before the courts stripped him completely bare. I did not rip the letter up. I did not throw it in the trash. I did not even write a reply. Instead, I walked over to the custom framing specialist I had hired for the morning. I handed him the tear-stained pages. Now, Julian's pathetic, shattered plea for mercy sits perfectly pressed inside a thick glass frame, hanging proudly on the wall directly beneath my official United States patent. Every time I sit at my desk, I look up at it. Everything he ever craved, everything he lied and stole and destroyed to build, now permanently bears my name. Thank you so incredibly much for listening to this story today. I would love to know where in the world you are tuning in from, so please let me know down in the comments. If you found today's story entertaining and satisfying, I want to gently remind you that our channel has been completely demonetized by YouTube, meaning we have zero budget to continue uploading new videos here for the foreseeable future. We are transitioning our entire operation over to Patreon. Please help us keep this community alive by joining the Boss Revenge Stories Patreon, where you can listen to our very best, absolute craziest, and highly detailed exclusive true stories that we simply cannot publish publicly on YouTube. You can join right now by scanning the Patreon QR code on your screen, or by clicking the link in the video description or the pinned comment. Thank you again, and I cannot wait to see you over there.